Okay, good evening. Welcome everyone. This is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and this week, as opposed to last week's show, we're going to take a look at just one game and a more stable game. So instead of a bunch of crazy kind of informal games, we're going to return to more solid, more stable tournament chess here, and games that are, let's say, I think it's entertaining, but it's not kind of a flash, slam bang kind of entertainment that we had last time. So I'm really not trying to scare you off from this game. It's not a boring game, but it's just not as flashy. But I think in part that makes this week's show a more instructive one. Okay, well anyway, you can decide for yourself how you like it. I hope that you will enjoy it. And what I'm going to show you today is a game that I played against a local expert here in northern Indiana. I don't really want to say his name just because I remember, well, and even now I can say that, all right, let me start the sentence over here. Say that when I was a low-rated player, I didn't really enjoy seeing my losses published, and since I'm a fair amount higher rated than my opponent, I don't really want to embarrass him. I mean, he's a very good player in his own right, so I'm showing the game for the instructional purposes only, and not as a sort of occasion for bragging. So we'll leave him anonymous here. He can always come forth and say who he is if he wants to. All right. At any rate, I'm white in this game. My opponent's black, and let's go ahead and begin. So e4, c5, knight f3, d6, d4, takes. And we enter the very popular and very interesting Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, named after the late Polish-Argentinian super grandmaster Miguel Najdorf. Now, there are a variety of ways that white can handle this, and depending on your style and the amount of time that you have to study theory and the degree to which you enjoy studying theory, you can pick any approach that you want to, really. You can find very sound, stable, solid positional approaches, and you can find absolutely crazy approaches, and you can find lines that are somewhere in between. So I've played both the really razor-sharp lines and the solid lines in my life, and at this point in time, what I kind of prefer is to go for lines where I'm playing two-result chess. So I'm generally speaking fairly confident in my abilities to play technical positions, and also when I'm playing a player who is as strong as my opponent, which is strong enough to beat me if I'm having a bad day and he's having a good day, and if I'm playing such an opponent, I want, when possible, to avoid playing variations where accidents can happen. So certainly I'm a better tactician than he is, but he's a good enough player that, under the right circumstances, an upset can happen. So I essentially want to play a game where if, I'm not playing so well and he's playing well, the most he should get is a draw, unless I just blunder outright. So that's what I go for in this system. So I play bishop to e3, e5, and now not knight to b3, which leads to some exceptionally sharp variations. So knight to b3 leads to all sorts of mayhem in these main lines where we have the players castling on opposite sides, and just anything could happen here. Alright, so this is what I want to avoid. A lot of theory. If he's better studied up on the latest wrinkles than I am, and or has a very good feel for the positions because he plays it all the time, whereas I don't, then bad things can happen. Alright, so I say this not to scare people off from playing principled lines. I think one should try to play main lines and make that the backbone of their tournament repertoire. But again, when you're playing a player that normally speaking you ought to beat, then I think it's at least reasonable to avoid lines where accidents are likely to happen, or likelier to happen. So what I played is the move knight to f3, and this is also a very good, very important system. In fact, let me check the stats here on this. Yeah, in fact, according to the Chess Base's PowerBook database, white scores 57.1% in the games in the database with knight to f3, and only 53.7% in the knight to b3 lines. So that's of course not conclusive, but given that it does well, and it is a popular line. I mean, it's been played by many strong grandmasters. I believe Ivanchuk, well, I know Ivanchuk played this and beat Topalov with it. Topalov with this last year. I believe Karjakin has played this, and many other strong players. So the idea here is essentially that white is playing for control over the d5 square. All right, so the knight on b3 is a poorly placed unit in white's camp, but it helps to provide his king with more shelter, and also gets the knight out of the way so white can play f3 and g4 in the English attack. So on f3, it's better placed. There are some positions where it could go to g5, other positions where it will try to maneuver its way to control over the d5 square. So we'll have a look at this shortly. So anyway, white's basic idea here is, as I said, to control d5, and to that end, a typical continuation will be something like bishop to g5, often followed up by swapping on f6. The bishop goes to c4, and this knight from f3 will go on a journey sometimes, let's say to d2, to f1, to e3, from where it'll hit both the d5 square and the f5 square. And with white castling on the king side, he has less to worry about from a tactical point of view as well. So that's, in a nutshell, the basic idea. It's a very solid, very stable way to play, and it's it has a sufficient degree of poison that even very strong grandmasters are capable of losing to the system and the idea behind it. And if it doesn't work, then white is not really going to pay a very heavy positional price. I mean, black is going to have to really work hard to outplay. Black's going to have to work really hard to outplay his opponent. So it's not at all likely to occur in any kind of quick way. All right, so my opponent played h6. This isn't the most common move, which is bishop to e7 straight away. Also possible is queen to c7 to prevent bishop to c4. But my opponent's choice is also fine, h6. Okay, so this prevents bishop to g5. I played bishop to c4. And now my opponent played bishop to e6. The basic and fundamentally correct idea of trying to neutralize my bishop, and again my control over the d5 square. Alright, so bishop to b3, and now knight b to d7, castles, and bishop to e7. Okay, now here, this is actually very similar to a game that I had the month before in the one of those Chicago IM Norm tournaments, and this was the April one, in which I played rather poorly, but I did win one good game against Gauri Shankar. And that game, okay, well, it didn't continue with queen e2 because actually in that game black had already castled, and here he played knight b to d7. So after castles it transposes, and then there I played knight to h4. Okay, so the idea is, of course, given that I can't exchange off my dark squared bishop, e3 is not going to be free for the knight from f3. So that route that I was mentioning before of going to d2 to f1 to e3 is, of course, unavailable for two reasons. I mean, f1 is covered, and even though that's easily remedied, the bishop on e3 doesn't have any good place to go. However, by playing knight to h4, I am trying to take advantage of a couple of other weak light squares on f5 and g6. And that game continued b5, a3, bishop takes b3, cb, knight e4, knight e4, bishop h4, and then knight takes d6. And actually maybe rook f to d1 could even be a slight improvement. And in either case, after either rook f to d1 or the move played in the game, knight takes d6, white has some advantage in the position. In part because the move f5 here for black is perhaps a bit overly committal. White has a number of good moves. I could play f3, I could play f4, or I could even play rook f to d1 or rook a to d1. So in all of these cases, white is in fact in quite reasonable shape. I would even say that white has a definite advantage here. Okay, so that's that game. But I decided here, of course again there's a slight difference, but I realized after playing queen e2 in that game, and then when my opponent played knight b to d7, that in fact the immediate knight to h4 would probably be an improvement, and so I played it straight away here. Okay, so what's my idea? Well, as I mentioned, the first basic idea is that I'd like to put the knight on f5. And by doing so, then, well, the knight is beautifully posted there. And if black takes the knight once it gets there, so let's consider just offhand some line-like castles. Knight to f5, takes and takes. Well, now that the bishop has left e6, I have more piece control over d5. And, okay, if black were to play something like knight to b6, I could consider here taking, knight to d5, takes. And even here, the move bishop takes d5 is possible, because if queen takes b2, rook to b1, and then my rook comes to b7. And although there are opposite colored bishops here, in fact the position is significantly in white's favor. You can see that my bishop on d5 is beautifully posted, it's very active, it's putting pressure on two diagonals, whilst the black bishop on e7 is shut in on the one hand by the pawn on d6, while on f6, g5, or h4 there's really not very much for it to do. Additionally, my kingside majority could be mobile in the context of whipping up a kingside attack. So among other possibilities, I might be able to follow up with queen to h5, h4, g4, and g5, with the idea of either g6 or f6. Okay, and in both cases presenting serious problems for black and his kingside safety. So this would be a situation where, in fact, opposite color bishops is very much in white's favor, and this is, I would say, a good general rule to bear in mind, that in circumstances where one player has genuine attacking chances, he's often very much benefited by the presence of opposite colored bishops. So that's one possible idea. Also, if black were to castle, another neat tactical idea is the move knight to g6. Okay, and this shows another light squared problem for black that he has to worry about here. So if he tries the exchange sack with bishop takes b3, then knight f8, bishop c4, knight d7, and he can't regain the material. And after queen d7, rook e1, white is simply up in exchange. Black has some compensation, but it certainly shouldn't be enough. Also possible, after knight to g6, is of course just to play rook to e8. And here I think white has a pleasant advantage by simply exchanging and then playing f4. And once again we see more light squared problems for black. So the knight is beautifully posted on g6, and if e takes f4, I might consider simply knight takes f4, with the point that, of course, if this pawn ever moves, then d5 becomes horrifyingly weak, and meanwhile I'll try to exert as much pressure as I can there. So I don't know that I'd play knight takes f4. I mean, bishop takes f4 certainly looks, well, okay, bishop f4, queen b6 check, maybe not the best. So yeah, probably knight takes f4 is the best move here, with a serious advantage. I think white is clearly better in this position. Okay, so black, I think, has some genuine problems to deal with after knight to h4. Note, of course, that knight takes e4 is no good, because knight takes e4, bishop takes h4, and knight takes d6 check is certainly very unpleasant for black. And this, I point out, is one reason why this my playing knight h4 straight away is an improvement over the Shankar game, because in this variation, knight takes d6 comes with check, and he hasn't castled yet. So what else can black play here? I mean, it's already, as I said, a difficult position. Of course, g6 is simply a crass blunder, because I take and play knight takes g6. And, well, what else really is there? So black is going to have to deal with white's very strong control over these central light squares, and this means I think that white has already a pretty substantive advantage. So my opponent spent quite a bit of time working out variations of this sort to his own dissatisfaction, and finally came up with the move knight to c5, which is itself a mistake. So see if you can work out the tactics here. Some of them are a little bit intricate, but I think with a little patience you should be able to work them out without too much difficulty. And if it is with difficulty, then it's just a very good exercise for you. So regardless of how much energy you have to exert in working this out, I think it's a beneficial exercise. Okay, well, I'll assume you've stopped the recording and have figured everything out for yourself. So here's how it goes. So first of all, white should play bishop takes c5, and this is indeed what I did play. Okay, now first of all, the simplest variation is if black recaptures the bishop, then I take the second bishop, yeah, I take, well, not the second bishop. I take his bishop, he takes the second bishop on his part, and then I play knight to g6, simply winning a pawn thanks to the fork here, with a completely winning position. Okay. The more complicated line is the one that he chose in the game, and that's with bishop takes b3. And here we have a little battle of the desperados that I'm gonna end up winning here. So bishop takes d6. This is what happened in the game. And here he played queen takes d6. So we'll come back to that, but that's actually just very simple and straightforward. Here I can either play a takes b3, which might have been a slight improvement over what I played, or queen takes d6. So in both cases, white's fine and has a very serious advantage, but perhaps AB was the more accurate move. At any rate, the more complicated variation, slightly more complicated variation, sees black continuing the play of the desperados with bishop takes c2. And now the best way for white to continue is simply queen takes c2, bishop takes d6, and now rook f to d1. So here, in fact, white has surrendered the chance to win the extra pawn, but it's very much to his benefit to do so. Now the threat is knight to f5, which simply wins on the spot, so black has to prevent this either by playing g6 to take that square away from my knight, or by moving his queen to c7 or b8. Alright, so let's see what happens if he plays queen to c7. Queen to b8 would come to the same thing. Well, knight to f5, and now I've got another double attack, so I'm hitting this one and that one. So bishop to f8 is required. Now rook a to c1, and here black is in serious trouble. So, for example, if g6, this loses just about immediately to, well, one simple way to proceed is knight to d5, and for example, if queen takes c2, then there's the amusing finish knight takes f6 mate. So if knight takes d5, then queen to b3, and I mean you can see that all of white's pieces are just ridiculously active, and black's king is in tremendous trouble, and white is winning here. Okay, but white can also just play queen to a4 check, and after queen c6, knight to d5 with, again, a familiar conclusion. Of course, we're threatening the queen, we're threatening knight c7, and above all, we're threatening knight takes f6 mate. So after rook a to c1, g6 is impossible if black wishes to survive, but after the better rook a to c8, still queen a4 check is decisive. Queen c6, knight to e2, and black is losing the queen because once more after queen takes a4, he gets mated, this time by rook takes c8. I guess I should address queen to b8, since that's going to be a little bit different, I think. So queen to b8, let's just check it out. Knight f5, bishop f8, and let's see how this variation will differ. So it looks as if black should still be in big trouble, but perhaps this time at least the trouble is slightly different. Okay, well, I suspect that if nothing else, and there probably is something else, knight to d5 should be pretty good. Knight a4 doesn't look too bad either, but okay, knight to d5 takes, rook takes, g6. Okay. So where's the knockout blow? I mean, one possibility might be queen to c3. F takes, rook takes e5, bishop to e7, and let's say e takes f5, threat of f6, oops, threat of f6, threat of rook a to e1, and if he plays king to e8, okay, how about rook e7, king e7, rook e1, king's got to go to the d file, rook to d1, king e7. Oh, I don't have queen e5. I was thinking I was just winning on the spot there. Alright, so maybe this isn't 100% clear. Of course, I'm doing this kind of on the spur of the moment. Let's see. Alright, let me give another quick try, see if I can find a knockout blow. I mean, of course, white has a big advantage here, pretty much no matter what, but it would be nice to find just an absolute crushing move here? I mean, knight to d5 does look right. Okay, well, knight a4 isn't bad. So knight a4 certainly bears consideration. The idea of playing knight to b6, and then maybe rook a to c1 and queen c8, if nothing else. And if black plays b5, then queen c6 is just mating on this, mating right away. All right, so probably there are many ways to win. This is at least my attempt to find one very quickly. So queen to b8 is not going to save the day. All right, and if g6, okay, then I think just simply rook to d3, and white is clearly better. The pressure on the d file is significant, and additionally the rook might shift over to the king side after black castles. So big advantage for white here. Okay, so going back to the game, that was what would happen on bishop takes c2 after bishop takes d6. So in the game, my opponent played queen takes d6, as I mentioned, and here I noted that a takes b3 is perhaps a touch better than what I played, but I took, he took, I took. Okay, now knight f5 is coming, and that would drive the bishop back to the miserable f8 square, so he castled while he could. Okay, and now here we have a position that might at first not seem to be that fantastic for white. So development is about equal, and I'm up a pawn, of course, but black has a bishop, an imbalance of a bishop for a knight, and also my extra pawn is a doubled pawn. So it may seem like white's advantage is actually fairly minimal, but I think that this isn't the case. I think white actually has a pretty serious, nearly winning advantage, and should be able to convert it with good play. So I think my technique the rest of the way was actually pretty good, and I think instructive. So I played knight f5, of course bringing my knight to a good square with gain of time, so that's easy. He played bishop to b4. Perhaps he should have played bishop to c5. Alright, so the move that he played is a very natural one, but after knight to d5, I'm gaining a passed pawn here. Now, on the other hand, black may be able to get his own kingside majority going. So, sure, I've got my majority on the queen side, but black would like to be able to play g6 and f5 at some point, and in conjunction with, let's say, a well-placed bishop on c5, plays e4. I mean, you can see that black could get a very active position here, where it would take quite a long time before my extra pawn was especially meaningful. So he played rook f to e8, I played c3, played bishop to f8. If he plays bishop to c5, I'm just going to play b4. And if he goes to a7, then he's giving up this d6 square, and also I can just play c4, c5 even more importantly. So the point is that after bishop to f8, of course, I can't advance my pawn to c5, because if I play b4, once I play c4, the b pawn would hang. And without the b pawn, it's not going to be possible to just play c4, c5 just using pieces. Okay, well, so here the bishop on f8 is actually very well placed. It's out of the way. I'm not going to gain any attacks. It's holding up my queen side, and it protects the h pawn preemptively, so we can now play g6 and f5. So here I would say this is a very good moment for you to figure out what white ought to play here. So granted, I'm a pawn up, but black is ready to expand and to make his position a very lively one. So what should I play in order to maintain control over the position, to not give black good counter chances? Well, the answer, and I think it's the right answer probably, is what I played here, and it's the move g4. So before I worry about my rooks, before I worry about advancing on the queen side, I wish to prevent my opponent from gaining counterplay, because my assets are all long-term assets. So my queenside majority isn't going anywhere. None of my pawns are in danger. I can bring my rooks to more active locations pretty much at my leisure. So what I have to do right away, though, is to prevent him from getting his kingside counterattack going, from making his majority start to have an influence on the position. So by playing g4, I'm preventing the g6 and f5 advance. Well, of course, he can play g6, and he does. And now I play knight to g3. Okay, so the reason to go to g3, of course, every square I go to will maintain control over f5 for the moment. But if I go to e3 instead, then this has a couple of drawbacks. So first of all, it's blocking the e-file, which I could use. Secondly, he could maybe play bishop to c5, and then he's got the threat of maybe taking and then pushing to f5 just the same. Also, after knight to g3, my knight has the potential to gain the e4 square at some convenient moment. So I think knight to g3 is definitely to be preferred. Okay, so here he played rook a to d8, I played rook a to d1, and now he plays king to g7. So this takes away any possibility of knight e4 f6, which is useful for him. Okay, I played rook f to e1, he played bishop to d6. And, okay, so I've restrained him, I've done a fine job of doing that, but meanwhile, of course, I have to make some progress myself. And so I don't want to give any hints here, so I'll again invite you to stop the recording at this moment and try to figure out what it is that white should play in order to make some progress here. And while you're thinking about that, or while you're thinking about that, I'll throw in here a quick mention of my blog, which I haven't done for a while. So my blog is at chessmind.powerblogs.com. No W's, just http chessmind.powerblogs.com. Of course, you have the colon and the slashes. Okay, so at any rate, that's my blog. Check it out. I think you'll enjoy it. And now back to the game. So here, of course, I want to bring my knight back into play. So my knight isn't really doing anything positive on g3. I mean, the prophylactic task that it's fulfilling on g3 is a very important one. But if I'm leaving my knight to restrain a pawn, that's a rather inefficient use of my resources. So I needed to do that at one point, but I don't want to do it forever. So what I played here is, I think, very good. I played h4. And my idea is simply to play h5, and then to capture on g6. And once my pawn gets to h5, then, okay, I mean, it's already too late. He could play h5, but that's no problem. He plays h5, I take, and he's still not going to get f5, and at least not without giving up a second pawn. And when I play h5, he plays g5, then he's giving away the f5 square. And if I take on g6, which happens in the game, so rook e7, h5, rook e to d7, h takes g6, whichever way he recaptures, he's going to lose the ability to play f5. So if he takes with the king, then there won't be any pawn support for it. In fact, I'll play knight f5 right away with a fantastic position, or almost right away. And f takes g6, which is what he played. Well, now his e-pawn is isolated, and there's no f-pawn anymore. Well, he doesn't have an f-pawn anymore. So again, I've got nothing to worry about. So now I can finally start to make some progress on my own plans here. So I play knight to e4, threatening to take on d6 and then capture the e-pawn, but also, of course, just putting my knight on a fantastic square, and on a square where the c4, c5 advance could be well supported. Because if I can achieve c5 and then d6, the game should simply be over. I mean, then my task will be more or less a trivial one. So he plays bishop to e7, protecting against the threat that I had of knight takes d6 followed by rook takes e5. I played c4, protecting my pawn, advancing my majority. He plays bishop to b4, rook e3. And here, rather than just simply waiting around on the d file for me to figure out a way to advance my pawns, whether by some means like rook e to d3 and c5, he decides to go for some counterplay with the move rook to f8. Alright, so once again it's time for a little prophylactic thinking, and I want to ask myself, well, what does my opponent want to do? And of course, potentially he wants to double rooks on the f file, and he'd also like to play the move rook to f4. So I want to kind of tidy things up here on my side of the board. Also, let's say he plays rook to f4. So let me give him a free move here. Rook to f4, I play f3. I also have to be a little careful about this diagonal too. Alright, so let's say he played rook d to f7. If I were to play a move like knight to d2, which of course I wouldn't play, then bishop to c5 would win. So with all of this in mind, I played king to g2. Alright, so now the point is that after rook f4, f3, there's no potential pin any longer. In fact, you'll notice that almost all of my pieces, are on light squares, where they're completely off limits to his bishop. Okay. Furthermore, by putting my king on g2, I'm protecting my f-pawn in advance against the doubling of rooks. And, well, just basically everything is under nice control here. Okay. And also, there might be some conceivable position where I could play rook to h1. So if he played h5, maybe I would exchange and play rook to h1. That's at least a possibility, in which case I have even more attacking prospects in the position. Okay, so here he decided that his rook was doing nothing on f4 and retreated it. And now I improve the position once again. I play knight to f2. So now the idea is to bring the knight over to d3. And I'm just going to gang up on this e-pawn here. So he decided not to even bother with its defense, but play bishop to c5. I took. He plays rook to f7. But of course, while my rook on e5 can no longer protect the pawn, the other rook can. So rook to d3. He brought the rook back to f4. And I simply played knight e4. His idea is to play bishop d4. So hitting the rook and the b2 pawn. Okay, it's not really a very serious threat, but knight to e4 even takes that away. So in this position, I'm up 2 pawns. I'm attacking the bishop. I'm probably going to be able to play rook to e7 check pretty shortly. I can just push my d pawn as well. And so here, my opponent resigned. So a very, very straightforward game, but while it all went quite smoothly, it went smoothly because of some good ideas that I had, and because I learned from some experience as well. So this knight h4 idea was kind of a cooked-up brainchild in the game with Shankar a few weeks before that, and it proved to be quite a powerful idea, and in this game worked very well. Also, I needed to calculate accurately some of the desperado situation combinations, and then finally, I think the way I handled the prophylaxis, first preventing the f5 break. So with the go back to here. So with this idea of g4 and knight g3, followed by h4 a few moves later, it looks very easy when you find moves like that, but that's precisely the point. If you don't find such moves, your opponent can put up great resistance. So the lessons to be learned here, aside from whatever interesting opening ideas I may have cooked up in your minds, is, again, the use of these prophylactic maneuvers. So there was no real rush for me in this position. So my assets are all long-term here. And when that's the case, the first thing you should think about then is, well, how can I prevent my opponent from gaining any counterplay? So if the tools that I have to win are always going to be there, then I want to make sure that the position remains as boring as possible so that I can win essentially at my leisure. So you don't have to hurry, except, again, to stop your opponent from getting what he or she wants. So I hope you found this instructive, and I think an attractive game in its own right as well. So no brilliant combinations or sacrifices, but still I think a very nice and smooth positional win for white in the game. And I would say a strategically kind of complete game as well. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you again next week. And I have no idea what I'll be presenting then, but trying to keep things varied. So last week we had some super sharp games. This week a more solid game. 2 weeks before we had a much more intricate and up and down battle. So trying to keep things interesting. You guys can let me know if I'm succeeding in my aims here. But at least, as I said, I hope even if you didn't find it especially entertaining, that you did find it instructive. So thanks again, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.